You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Thanks for listening. And if you're joining us on YouTube, thanks for watching. If you're on Discord, thanks for listening in. This is being recorded live on our Discord channel. To find out more, you can visit our website, vsl.aero. And this is a question and answer based aviation podcast if you're joining us for the first time. If you've maybe heard about some of my other podcasts where I cover the ACS, this is kind of in the same vein as that, but it's not the long series where I deep dive into the ACS. More of a podcast where I can answer your questions you have about aviation or Checkrides specifically. We're going to cover a few of those today, and if you're on our Discord channel, you can ask those questions live, and I'll bring you across on the podcast. So without further ado, we'll get started. All right, so last week was our first week of question and answer time. This week we're moving on. I think I've got about 5 questions lined up, and we'll see if any more trickle in. And they're all interesting questions, I think. So the first one is from Kyle. And I took out Kyle's last name because, whatever. I don't know if everybody wants their full name being read off here. If you do, just let me know and I'll leave it in there. But Kyle says, "Hi Seth, my name's Kyle. I have a commercial single and multi working on my CFI. His check ride's on December 30th for that, so good luck with that, Kyle. We're all rooting for you." He says, "Firstly, I want to thank you for the incredible, valuable content that you contribute to the industry. I've shared your work countless others who have attributed to success to your material." Well, I really appreciate that, Kyle. I really do. Kind of the word of mouth of the channel and all the stuff that I do here. I really appreciate that. He goes on to say, "Secondly, I wanted to ask you a question that might help other future or current CFIs. I really enjoyed your video with Josh on 5 weird maneuvers that will make you a better pilot. In that video, you touched on finding data points for aircraft using the PAC method. My question is in reference to finding and utilizing correct landing speeds for different weights and configurations. The AFH states, and you also mentioned, to use the manufacturer's published landing speed in absence of that, you utilize 1.3 VSO. I've found, at least in the 172 or the Piper or Citabria, that the manufacturer's short-field landing speed is too fast and requires an approach with excessive floating. If the numbers are the touchdown point, the flare has to occur well before the runway, leading to cutting the grass or dragging it in. 1.3 VSO, in my experience, he says it's between 8 and 10 knots less, provides a much more stabilized approach and flare as you stated and demonstrated. I feel as a future CFI, it's my job to accurately teach the FAA publications and regulations. In this scenario, should the CFI teach a student to use the manufacturer's landing speed as the AFH states or 1.3 VSO? Thank you for your insight, Kyle." Well, thank you for your question, Kyle. So just so everybody's on the same page, I did a video probably 2 years ago now with Josh from Free Pilot Training, and we flew his 172. And one of the maneuvers we did is we flew the airplane at different configurations and did like an envelope discovery flight. And one of the things we did is we found the full brake stall at VSO, which is in the landing configuration. And then we multiplied 1.3 by that number to come up with a short field landing approach speed to use. And what Kyle is saying is true for a lot of the newer Cessna 172s especially, is that the manufacturer's short field approach speed is actually higher than that 1.3 VSO that you can calculate on your own. And it sounds like Kyle using the manufacturer's approach speed is doing what's also really common, and that's you experience a float at the end of that landing where you float past your aim point. And remember, for the short field approach, be it in the private or commercial or CFI level, we are really concerned about that hitting that aim point. We really want to be consistently within 50 feet of where we want to aim. So if you're aiming at the beginning of the 1,000-foot markers, really no later than midway down the 1,000-foot markers, you need to be touching down. So you can't afford to float there. And so there's a couple of things, Kyle, that I think might be the issue here, and also a couple of ways I think you can address this as a CFI. First, I think there's value added in teaching the 1.3 VSO. Going out and discovering that number with your students, I think, is a really good exercise. I think every CFI should go out there and find a full stall in the landing configuration, multiply that by 1.3, and use that for an approach speed just to show the student, okay, this is the minimum speed that the FAA recommends, and then fly the approach at the manufacturer's speed, which I've noticed has gone up over the years, but for the newer Model 172s, it's around 10 knots above that calculated number. So let's say you calculate 52, the manufacturer's approach speed is going to be around 62. Okay, so I would recommend definitely discovering that, 1.3, doing the math on it and letting your student experience that. That's a really good exercise. The next thing is on the, for checkride purposes, absolutely we want to use the manufacturer's approach speed. You don't want to make up your own approach speed if the manufacturer has published one. The ACS is pretty clear on that. So as examiners, we're going to be expecting the student to fly that published approach speed. Okay, but next, let's look at how the short field, the Airplane Flying Handbook tells us to do the short field approach, and that might actually help what you're experiencing. So I've got the ACE guide pulled up here, and we're going to go to the Airplane Flying Handbook, and we're looking at this time landings, and we're going to go to short field approach and landing and scroll over here. So on page 9-21 of the Airplane Flying Handbook, it just mentions this just for a second here, but it's really important that you fully understand this. So when the field is made, the pilot should extend full flaps and lower the nose in order to maintain airspeed and keep the aiming point stationary in the windscreen. When over the obstacle, the pilot may reduce power slightly. Okay, so that is what I want you to focus on, is once you're over that obstacle, you can reduce the power slightly. So that information tells us that if you're flying the short field approach speed from 50 feet down, you're probably flying too fast, because there's actually two speeds, and you sort of mentioned it. I don't know if you did this intentionally in your email, but at the beginning of the email, you're talking about approach speed, but then in this third paragraph here, you say landing speed. So that's an important distinction, right? Our approach speed isn't our landing speed. Our landing speed is going to be something less than that. Because remember, in order for the airplane to land, especially in our short field, we want all of the lift to be out of the wings. We want the airplane essentially to be stalled, and we want that stall to occur, just a couple of inches above the runway ideally, and that way all of the lift is out of the wing. Well, at approach speeds, you're nowhere near stalling, right? You're more than 1.3 or 30% over your stall speed. So your approach speed is a safe speed margin above stall, and what the Airplane Flying Handbook is hinting at, and what some of the 172 manuals even hint at, is they will tell you your speed at 50 feet is 62 knots. And what we want you to do is you need to be reducing the power starting at about 50 feet to start transitioning from approach speed to landing speed. Now that's where all the finesse in this landing comes into play, because if you make that power pull too rapidly, you're going to bleed off too much energy, and you could stall the airplane much too high, and you would have a hard landing, right? If you don't pull the power enough, now you're carrying energy basically through the round out and flare, and that's going to cause you to float even more, even more than you normally would. So it's definitely a balance there of when you pull the power, how much pitch change that you make to make sure that you bleed off enough energy that where when you flare, you're going to basically be right at your touchdown speed rather than that approach speed. And then knowing the fact that the way you're calculating your 1.3 VSO, it might be a little bit fast anyway. Another thing to account for if you're doing this exercise yourself is normally I don't make my students do the calculation for calibrated airspeed, but that's another thing to take into account is when you're out there doing your stall, your VSO, you need to take that calibrated number and figure out what your actual indicated stall speed was there and correct for that error there, because there's going to be a position error because of the high angle of attack when you're doing the stall. So that may also account for it being slightly lower than the approach speed. So, but I think part of it is Cessna mitigating some risk and just having us fly a little bit faster. So instead of 1.3, maybe 1.35 or 1.4. I don't think it's as high as 1.4, but somewhere around there, just to mitigate risk. And I say that because that seems to be the Cessna's trend, is they want to avoid liability, and they make the speeds faster. And that's what I've seen in the POHs. You look at a much older POH, and the speeds are going to be slower. For one, they're in miles per hour, but even when you do the conversion, it's slower than the knots of a modern 172. So I think they've just increased it a little bit. So short answer, do both. Do 1.3, do the published POH speeds, but definitely make sure they're doing the POH speeds for the Checkride, and then practice that maneuver where you're pulling the power around 50 feet, which is clear of your obstacle, right? And just as a reminder, in case you missed it, I did a video about the math here, but if you do the Pythagorean theorem, the a squared, b squared, c squared thing, if you do that on the runway, right above the runway at 50 feet on a 3-degree glide slope, you're aiming 1,000 feet down. So if your airport is equipped with PAPIs, look at the threshold crossing height. The threshold crossing height on the 3-degree glide slope for your home runway is probably somewhere around 50 feet. So if you have white over red, or you have 2 red, 2 white, and you're coming in on glide slope, on a 3-degree glide slope, with 1,000-foot markers, you're going to be crossing the threshold right at 50 feet. So I use the reminder of when the numbers disappear underneath the nose, that's when I'm going to start pulling power. And what we're doing there, the goal is to reduce that speed to make it closer to landing speed and not approach speed. All right, on to question number 2. And thanks, Kyle, for the question. That was great. This question is from John. John says, my name's John. I'm a CFI working on my multi. Longtime fan of your YouTube channel. Just watched your first podcast video and wanted to ask a question about multi-engines that I can't find the answer to. Well, I love multis. That's my specialty, so I love that. He goes on, regarding the factors for determining the critical engine, I keep seeing the acronym PAST, P-factor, accelerated slipstream, spiraling slipstream, and torque. Try saying that like 4 times fast. Yet the only thing mentioned in any FAA document is P-factor. While I understand the other 3 factors, I can't find any FAA source for them, including the FAA sources referenced in the commercial ACS. As a DPE, would you prefer a candidate to use the past factors that I can't seem to source, or the explanation used by the FAA? Thank you in advance. If you find time to respond, your content on YouTube was a huge help whilst working on my CFI, especially your recent videos explaining systems, which are so good. Well, thank you, John. Yeah, the systems videos are really popular. I love doing them and look forward to finishing up the electrical system, and then we'll see where it goes next. Hopefully I have time this winter to do that. All right, on to your question. So first off, you might not have dug quite hard enough to find the FAA source data. So first, let's look at that, because there actually is an FAA source document that talks about past factors in terms of multi-engine aircraft. So for that, we're going to pull up the ACE guide, and we are going to go over to the commercial multi-engine section, and there I have this document called Flying Light Twins Safely. Now you can find this online for free, of course, just FAA Flying Light Twins Safely. It has the document number 8740-66, but that's not important. We're going to look at page 2 of this document. And on page 2 of this document, that's where the 4 factors you mentioned are explicitly listed in connection to asymmetric thrust while flying a multi-engine aircraft. The P-factor, accelerated slipstream, spiraling slipstream, and torque. All right, so hopefully that answers your question about where you can find the past acronym in reference to, an FAA source on that. Now, I did find it interesting. I didn't really anticipate this, but in the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 13 is all about transitioning to multi-engine aircraft. So I would have expected the past acronym to be mentioned here, but you're right, it's actually not. So if we go to Chapter 13 and we look at engine inoperative principles, the derivation of VMC is page 13-23. And you're right, the last paragraph in this just mentions P-factor. It doesn't mention the other left turning tendencies, which I thought was actually kind of interesting. And I could see how that could cause a little bit of confusion where you're trying to use the FAA source data, and in Chapter 13, you're reading in there, and it doesn't say anything about the PAST acronym, and you have to go to this other companion guide, the Flying Light Twins Safely, which isn't linked in here, although it probably should be, or I think they should just take all the stuff that's in that handbook and put it into the airplane flying handbook. But I digress. It's not in there. So I think that is maybe an issue that needs to be corrected on a future version of the airplane flying handbook. Now, my other answer for this is that those tendencies that you mentioned, the PAST acronym, those are not unique to multi-engine aircraft. So the other location you can find those, and we'll go back to our global menu here, the PHAC, Aerodynamics of Flight, and we'll look at that's basic propeller principles. So in the PHAC, in our basic propeller principles, that's where it talks about all of these factors. We've got torque and P factor and torque reaction, corkscrew effect, gyroscopic action, asymmetric loading, P factor. So all of those are talked about in the PHAC in regards to just piston-driven or piston-powered, propeller-driven aircraft. So those are all basic left turning tendencies that you should have learned whenever you're flying your single-engine aircraft. They're not unique to that Seminole or the Baron that you're flying now. So that just shows that you have that correlation of knowledge, that you're taking this basic principle that was true in a single-engine aircraft and how it's going to negatively affect us even more in a multi-engine aircraft. So yeah, the basic answer to your question is there's plenty of FAA source data for those factors, but you're right in that they are not listed in Chapter 13 of the Airplane Flying Handbook. So that may be something, I don't know if there's a place for you to send in a recommendation to the FAA and say, hey, y'all should probably update this stuff. But that's something that I might do is suggest, hey, let's take all the stuff in there in the Flying Light Twin Safely and go ahead and incorporate that into Chapter 13. All right, well, thanks, John. I hope that answers your question. So now we're on to question 3. This is from Michael Farlow. Now I've known Mike a while. I went ahead and put his name in here. He's all over Reddit and Facebook. You might have heard of him. I got the chance to meet him when I was down in Texas giving a Beechcraft seminar. Great guy. And we correspond back and forth fairly regularly. And he sent a question regarding the new updates to the CFI. So I'll read this real quick. Hopefully your expertise will help with this. I was endorsing a student's logbook today for his knowledge exam, and your recent content on CFI changes made me think of this question. With the changes on CFI signatures going from expires to RE, does this mean when we sign pre-printed endorsements in the logbooks, we need to scratch out the pre-printed EXP date and replace it with RE? If you think number 1 is true, then that might make a good topic for one of your YouTube short videos. Well, Mike, I think it's a really good topic, and I'll go ahead and include it in the podcast here. So back to the ACE menu, I've got the new advisory circular 6165J. Now, this just came out, I think, last month, and we'll go to the sample endorsements page here. The sample endorsements start on page A-7 of that advisory circular. And this AC is the one we've always used, the 6165, and it has all of the sample endorsements that we can basically copy into somebody's logbook. This is also what logbook manufacturers use, like Sporties and Gleim and whoever else that pre-print the endorsements and put them in the back of the logbooks. So if you're an instructor or if you're somebody that just started your flying career, then this will affect you because that logbook that you have isn't up to date with the 6165J right now. And if you're listening to this into the future, hopefully they are updated. But what has happened is the signature line has changed format, but it's only changed, or it only changes format when you have the new type of CFI certificate. And that certificate doesn't have an expiration date. And so that's the answer to your question, Mike, is if the flight instructor certificate you're using has an expiration date, you're going to still put on the expiration date on your signature line. You will include that. If your flight instructor does not have an expiration date, you will put the RE verbiage, right? And the RE verbiage will need to be the end of your recent experience. So, for example, let's say you were issued a flight instructor certificate today, and it's December 9th of 2024. 24 calendar months after that is when your privileges as an instructor will expire, and you will need to do some sort of a renewal activity or recent experience activity, which is also defined in 6165J. There's like 6 ways that you can renew or rehack your experience. So if you were issued that certificate today or met that requirement today, 24 calendar months from today would be December 31st of 2026, because we go to the end of the month and then that year, so it's always at the end of the month. So December 31st of 2026 would be your RE date that you would put there. Essentially, it's your old expiration date. That's what you're putting there. The problem I have with this, overall, I don't think it's a bad thing, and it was just a cost-saving measure by the FAA. You can actually read the rule change, and they said, I think it's around $5 million in savings by not having to print out certificates, the plastic certificates, and mail them out to every CFI every 24 calendar months. They don't have to do that anymore, so we just keep the same certificate, and it'll sit there in our wallet wearing out like all the other ones. And all we have to do is log that recent experience through the renewal process, which is basically the same, and we do that on IACRA, and we do some sort of renewal activity either through activities or using the WINGS program or our duties and responsibilities at another job. Like I said, there's about 6 different ways that we can renew. So you fill out the 8710, you have an examiner like myself or an ASI at the FSDO, sign it off, and it will make you recurrent again for another 24 calendar months. The problem I have with this, and it's not a huge problem, but it is something to think about, is before, if somebody asked me, hey, are you a current CFI? I can just show them my CFI certificate, and it has an expiration date that's usually 12 to 18 months in the future, depending on how recent it is. And they can see, oh, well, that date is in the future, so clearly you're a current CFI. Now, if somebody asks, hey, are you a current CFI? Well, there's no date on my certificate, so I'm going to have to go to either the Airman Records database, or I'm going to have to go into IACRA and show, hey, my 8710 for renewal was signed 12 months ago, meaning I have another 12 months of currency. So it's maybe just a little more labor intensive to prove to someone that you are actually a current CFI. So that's a little bit of a challenge. Apparently the FAA thought, hey, that's worth $5 million. That's a little bit of inconvenience, but it's going to save us some money. So that's what they went with there. So hopefully that answers your question, Mike. I really appreciate the interaction there. All right, question 4. This is coming from our Discord channel, and I'm actually recording this live on Discord. This is kind of a reminder. I've had a couple people pop in the Discord. Nobody wanted to jump in live on the podcast, and that's fine. Hopefully it'll catch on later. I'm not too worried about it. But if you go to our website, vsl.aero, I've got a pretty active Discord that I try to check in on daily. Sometimes it goes a few days without it. But it's a great place for CFIs and students, and if you have a question, post it. We have a lot of great CFIs, a lot of great knowledge in the Discord, so a lot of times I get on there, I haven't looked at it in a few hours, and already the answers are correct. The conversation has happened, the question is answered, and I can just jump in and give a thumbs up. Sometimes it's a little more complicated, or it's directly specifically at me, and in that case, I'll jump in and I'll answer it. So in this case, I really like this question. This one says, I forget which user it came from. It doesn't matter. He knows who he is. But he asked, does AATD time count as dual given for the purposes of the required 15 hours of dual for 6165? Or just up to 20 hours of simulated instrument time? I always figured the AATD wasn't dual because it's not an airplane. Rather, I count it as ground instruction. Okay, well, this is a really good question. I've never run into this problem, and just to be clear, what we're talking about here is for the instrument rating, right? For the instrument rating, we need 40 hours of simulated instrument time total. Of those 40 hours, at least 15 need to be with a CFII. And so what he's asking here is those 15 that are required to be a CFII, could we do those in an AATD? Well, definitionally, I think the answer is yes. And to actually prove my point, we actually need to dig into Part 61 of the FARs. So again, we can do that looking at I'm going to pull up my plan of action for a Part 61 instrument, and it's going to take us directly to the Code of Federal Regulations for 61, or for instrument rating requirements. And we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom because that's where it talks about use of flight training devices. So paragraph I, use of an aviation training device, it says a maximum of 10 hours in an instrument time received in a basic aviation training device, or a maximum of 20 hours of instrument time received in an AATD may be credited for the instrument time requirements of this section if the device is approved by the FAA, an authorized instructor provides the instrument time in the device, and the FAA approved instrument training and instrument tasks performed in the device. So that paragraph right there tells me, hey, the FAA approved instrument training and instrument tasks performed in the device. So this means we need more information because it has to be FAA approved. And to find that, we would have to see the device's LOA. So right here is the device's LOA, and you can see here it's approved for logbook entries, logging training time, and instrument experience, instrument proficiency check per the ACS, and instrument rating up to 20 hours. And so right there, the LOA says, yes, it's approved for instrument training time. And then if we were doing it under Part 141, we could see that for an instrument training time for a 141 course, it's not a set number of hours, it's 40% of the total instrument training time requirements. Okay, so now let's dig a little bit deeper, because you might be thinking to yourself, well, there's only 15 hours required with a double I, right? What if I did all 15? Because I'm allowed to do up to 20 in an AATD. So could I do all 15 of my dual received from a double I and a sim, and then just do the remainder of my 40? Could I just do that in an airplane and then go to my checkride? Well, no, because if you look further up in 6165, where it defines the aeronautical experience, so right here is the line. So paragraph 2 says we have to have 40 hours of actual or simulated instrument time total, 15 of which must be received from an authorized instructor, right? But then the subparagraph to that says 3 hours of instrument flight training from an authorized instructor in an airplane. Okay, so that means that these 15 hours, of those 15 hours, at least three of those have to be in an actual airplane. Okay, and remember, these are all just minimum hours. You know, if you're out there and you've got 60 or 70 hours of simulated instrument, and you've got 40 hours of that is with a double I, then all this really doesn't matter that we're talking about it, because you're not trying to use the simulator time to count towards your qualification for the checkride. Where this would really come into play if you're trying to maximize the use, or really minimize your cost, but maximize the use of the simulator to avoid spending a lot of money in an airplane. So I think you could do this. Now, interestingly, he farmed this question out to 2 other DPEs in the FSDO, and both the other DPEs and the FSDO said, we don't really know, but we think that all of those 15 hours need to be in an airplane, so just do it in the airplane. Which to me is like, okay, well, that's the easy answer. And realistically, like I said, I've been doing this for years, and I've never come across somebody that tried to do this, so I know it's not very common anyway. So their answer is fine. Yeah, in the real world, you're going to do most 15 hours. You're going to do that in the plane. And what's more, you're probably going to have more than 15 hours of dual received from a double I in preparation for your instrument exam. At least that's what I see commonplace. So it's a fun question to tackle, even though it's not like, super relevant. Okay, this next one. I got my questions a little bit out of order here. Question 5. So this question actually came from Reddit, and I'd like to incorporate Reddit a little bit into this podcast, because I do jump onto Reddit, and there's some interesting conversations that happen there. And some of them I like to jump on and give my answer to, just to interact, and I do occasionally make posts on Reddit as well. But I thought this one was interesting. Anyway, I stumbled upon this post on Reddit earlier today on my commute down where I'm at. I'm in Pensacola this evening. But on my commute down here, I saw this, and I was like, man, this is right in line with the type of stuff I like to interact with. So the first part, or the post is, why is a cause check taught for engine failure in cruise in a PA-44? The Seminole has a feather locking system that prevents feather when below 950 RPM. This should mean that if there's an engine failure in cruise, if the prop stops before the oil pressure is lost, there would be no way to feather the prop. And the Seminole's mediocre performance, the feathering of the prop as soon as possible should be prioritized. However, my school teaches to do a cause check, which is quite long in the Seminole, using up valuable time. Okay, so this user is basically asking, if we have an engine failure, why are we taking time to try to analyze that engine failure? Why don't we just immediately feather it? Because they seem to be worried that the prop locks are going to engage and they won't be able to feather the propeller after a certain amount of time. And that's an understandable risk or worry. But because of a lot of other things that I'll talk about here, I think from a risk management standpoint, it's a lot better if we go ahead and try to analyze that if we're at an appropriate altitude. And I on my post or response to him, unfortunately this post got deleted. It's still on there, you can find it, but it's a deleted post now. But my comment's still on there. So anyway, I basically said that, when the engine stops, when the engine stops producing combustion, the windmilling force from the propeller continues to spin the engine and all the accessories. Right, so based on just aerodynamic law, right, that propeller is out there and it's spinning the engine and all of its components at around 1,000 RPM or to 1,500 RPM. Kind of depends on your airspeed, and you probably could do some mathematical calculations if you take in the diameter of the propeller, the pitch of the propeller, the aerodynamic efficiency of the propeller, and then measure the torque required to overcome the engine resistance, like the mechanical resistance. And you could come up with a speed that an airspeed to fly that would give you an RPM over 950 RPMs. I think that would be a waste, though, because based on just my basic experience in many, many different light twins, if you're above blue line, that propeller will be spinning at an RPM greater than the speed at which the propeller locks engage. And those propeller locks will only engage at a much lower RPM, and they'll only act as a stop, right? They're not actually a lock. It's not like something's coming in and attaching to the prop and preventing it from ever feathering again. All it is it's a low pitch stop. So this pin comes out, the propeller, a piece of the propeller bracket actually runs into that pin and it won't let it go any further. So even if you were to, in theory, run into these locks, you could pitch the nose over, increase airspeed slightly, the RPM would increase, the stop would disengage, and you could feather it from there. So it's not quite as that drastic, thing that's going to happen and lock out your propeller. The other thing is, the most common reason for an engine failure is some sort of fuel starvation or fuel exhaustion event. I guess another reason might be magnetos or air intake. You've got a blocked air intake. All of those things you can troubleshoot only when the propeller is windmilling, right? As soon as you feather the engine, you can't troubleshoot the mags because the mags aren't running. You can't troubleshoot the fuel system because the fuel system isn't working. You can't troubleshoot the propeller governor because the propeller governor isn't working, right? None of those things that went wrong with your engine can you troubleshoot with a static engine. You can only troubleshoot it when it's windmilling. So that's why I think most people recommend, if you're above 3,000 feet AGL, I would go with a analysis, try to analyze why the engine failed first before you feather it. And I actually give the section of the commercial ACS skill 10 Alpha Sierra 4 is the one that says that pilots are expected to determine and address the cause of engine failure before fully securing the engine. So even the ACS says, hey, you need to try to troubleshoot the failed engine before you secure it. So that's another reason why flight schools would be teaching that, troubleshooting step before you feather the engine. So I posted that, and then of course the user deleted the comment, so it did a lot of good. Next question. This is our last question we'll handle here. And this one came from Discord, and it came tonight, actually. I was getting ready for the check ride, and I saw this. And the question was, is it possible for a student pilot to complete a private pilot check ride in a J3 Cub? My intuition tells me no, mainly due to the instrument flying tasks and the lack of requisite instrumentation in the plane, but I figured I'd ask here in case there's any sort of exemption or exception that I'm not finding. Well, I'm glad they asked here because, yes, absolutely, a private pilot check ride can be done in a J3 Cub. And I think we have to maybe define this clearly. A J3 Cub, I'm assuming you mean a original J3 Cub, which those were produced without an electrical system or any avionics to speak of. Now, I say that because newer J3s, you can go out and you can buy a carbon Cub or you can buy a Legend Cub, and all of them have electrical systems and really nice avionics. So I don't think that's in question there. We're talking about the OG J3 Cubs that were back from, a 1947 with no electrical system. So there's actually, this is a good thing to find here. In the ACE guide, if you tap on the paper clip there, this is in additional documents, and it's an info. There's only two info notes in the ACE guide, and one has to do with non-electric aircraft. So that's info 17003. This came out in 2017, right when the new ACSs were coming out. And it came out because the ACS inadvertently, for a short time, said that for a private pilot check ride, you had to use installed electronic navigation system. Well, the FAA received a lot of complaints when that ACS came out saying, hey, with the old PTS, we could do a private pilot check ride in a J3 Cub, no problem. But now this ACS says we have to use installed electronic navigation system, and an old airplane doesn't have that. So what do we do? And so the FAA is like, hey, you're right, valid point. We didn't mean to do that. So we're going to change the verbiage from installed to on board. So now it just says, you have to use on-board navigational equipment, which means that you could do it in a non-electric J3 Cub, and you've got ForeFlight pulled up there, and when it gets to the navigation skills, let's look at those real quick. We can look at the private pilot ACS, and we're going to go to basic instrument maneuvers, radio comms and navigation gear. Right here, the skills are maintain airplane control when selecting proper communication frequencies, identifying appropriate facility, and managing navigation equipment. Okay, we can do all of that with ForeFlight and a handheld radio, right? That's pretty easy. Comply with ATC instructions. We can simulate that. We do that all the time. Okay, so now we'll go back to private pilot. That's basic navigation, or that was basic instruments. Let's look at navigation procedures. So navigation systems use an airborne electric navigation system. So not installed, just airborne electric navigation system. So that could just be a GPS, handheld GPS. We can use that system. Determine the airplane's position. We can do that. We can intercept a course. We can recognize and describe the indication of waypoint passage. We can do all this stuff. We can do all this with a onboard navigation system. It doesn't have to be installed. So it does, and of course I've got the info note in the ACE guide is referenced on this page of the ACS. It takes you directly there. But big picture, yeah, you can use an aircraft without an electrical system for a private pilot check ride. You don't need to use two different aircraft. There does need to be some forethought put into that, right? You need to have a handheld radio in the plane. You need to have a GPS. Some of the handheld radios can track a VOR, so I guess you could do it with just a handheld radio. Some of the handheld radios have built-in GPSs. I've never used that specifically, but what I have done is I've had a handheld radio and a cell phone running ForeFlight, and that's what we did the check ride with. We were able to meet all of the skills, and that follows that info note. It follows the the FARs, I believe Part 6145 and 6143 are the two subchapters that talk about required equipment on a checkride. So that answers that question. Anyway, we've got a few more people in the Discord, and I guess this is the part of the podcast. This is totally new. Y'all are seeing this live. I've never done this before. Hopefully do it again. But y'all have listened to some, or I don't think all of the podcasts, but y'all have listened to some. Y'all are on this Discord channel and you're live. Any questions that y'all want to ask, or we can talk? I've been going 47 minutes, so we can go a little bit longer. How's it going, guys?
I would say, for sort of elaborating on the engine failure thing that you were discussing, one of the sort of main reasons that I think that you should try to troubleshoot it before you feather it would be if the propeller is still windmilling, it'll feather anyway later on. If it doesn't continue windmilling, say like oil pressure causes the engine to completely lock up, it doesn't really matter if it's feathered because it's not windmilling anyway.
Yeah.
So it's not like as drag efficient as being feathered, but it's not nearly as bad as windmilling.
I think you're right. I think it's negligible. And that's actually a point that I made on the post, is that the one exception to the one time I would want to feather it immediately would be if I had an indication of a loss of oil pressure. And I actually had this happen to me once. I was flying a Baron at night in IMC conditions with passengers, like all the things were happening. And it's called an ADEL clamp, but an ADEL clamps are used to hold hoses in the right place. Well, this clamp was installed incorrectly, and it had rubbed a hole in an oil line. And so I was flying along, minding my own business, and we're about 10 minutes out from our destination airport, luckily. And I hear a change in my prop sync, which is not normal for this plane. I had the props perfectly synced, and I just hear this, now my props are out of sync, and I didn't touch anything. And I look down at my RPM, and sure enough, my RPM is just slightly dropping off on the left engine. Then I look down at my left oil pressure, and I see the left oil pressure is rapidly dropping to 0. And so I immediately reach up, I identify the left, and I immediately feather the left engine, kill the mixture. I take my flashlight and I shine it out the left, right there over my shoulder, out at the left nacelle, and it is just covered in oil. So there was no restarting that engine. Now, had I not feathered that immediately, it might have, like you said, John, it might have hit the feather stops, so it would have decayed in RPM slowly enough that the feather locks might have engaged. It would have hit those low pitch stops, but since the engine was out of oil, it would have sat there and probably done maybe a minute of windmilling until it seized up the entire engine, and then it would have just seized. And instead of nice feathered propeller blades, I would have flat propeller blades, which I think would be a marginal difference. It wouldn't be that bad. Not nearly as bad as windmilling. But that's the one case where I would say go ahead and feather it immediately. In all other cases, you're not up against like some time limit. I think you could fly until you're out of fuel, and that RPM would never decay to the point where it would hit the feather stops. I just don't think it would happen. I can't prove that, but I can say personally I've flown around for several minutes with a windmilling propeller, and I've never had it run into the low pitch stops.
Yeah, same. At least I've only flown a Seminole, but it's definitely not a thing on the Seminole.
Hey Seth, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Happy to chime in. So I gather that this is a podcast. I wanted to ask a question a little bit about, is there any specific question does it have to be a specific, is it this multi-engine or is it anything?
Just anything.
Oh, okay. Well, if there was one thing that you could take out of the ACS, then what would it be? For private pilot, commercial pilot, like the ones that are kind of more stick and rotor based.
One thing that I could take out. I've never been asked that question. I don't know. I was just talking to somebody about, the performance maneuvers. And I probably need to hedge my comment here saying this is just my personal, thoughts. I'm not representing the FAA in any way here. But the two events that I think are more like circus tricks, like it's hard for me to steelman a case of why you need to be proficient at these maneuvers on how they're making you a better pilot, would be chandelles and lazy eights. They're a finesse maneuver, and I get it, but they just kind of stick out to me in the ACS as things that aren't like super useful of being a good day-to-day safe pilot. I guess they do teach you energy management and finesse, but they're almost too subjective to evaluate really well, if you know what I mean. I don't love them. They're kind of not my favorite maneuvers.
There's a lot of maneuvers like that,
Yeah,
I think.
those two specifically.
Well,
but for the private, I know the answer for the private for sure, 100%. Do y'all? What do y'all think it'll be? Y'all have any guesses as to what maneuver I hate on the private pilot?
Rectangular course?
Nope. My least favorite is the emergency descent.
Yeah, okay.
And the reason is the emergency descent, I feel like, is training private pilots to panic almost. At least that's how it seems. It's really, again, it's hard for me to steelman a case for where an emergency descent would be appropriate, because a lot of people use engine fire, and it even says up here in Knowledge Topic 1, situations that would require an emergency descent. The first thing it says is depressurization, which is 100% in agreement. I agree. That's the reason we do an emergency descent. But then it says smoke or engine fire. Now, those two, that drives me crazy. An engine fire is absolutely not a reason to do an emergency descent. An engine fire, you cut off fuel to the engine, and you try to, remove the fuel source, and then you're in a glider. That's it. There's no reason to scream at the ground. Now, if you have an uncontrolled engine fire, yeah, that's a reason to do emergency descent. Smoke, what does it mean? Like smoke in the cockpit? I guess. I mean, electrical fire, again, what this does though is a student pilot is reading this and they see smoke or an engine fire, and then they come to the check ride and I give them a smoke or engine fire, and rather than calmly doing the checklist and removing the fuel source or turning off the electrical system, they just start screaming at the ground like a kamikaze, like the goal of this is to die from impact forces rather than burn to death. That's a little gory, but that's that's what I'm imagining. I'm like, the goal of emergency descent really is a depressurization event, and that's why I don't think it should be in the private pilot exam. I think it should be a commercial maneuver, and we should be simulating a depressurization event. But when would you be doing a private pilot check ride in a pressurized aircraft? That's just such a niche use case. I don't think it's useful to be in this ACS.
Yeah, and follow-up question, what's one thing you would add to the ACS?
I would add something similar to the CFI drag demo. So the CFI ACS, the slow flight and configuration demonstration. The way they wrote it out here is rather long. It would take a while. But I think this exercise at the private pilot level is great, because I would love to be able to see a pilot fly the airplane at the minimum maneuvering airspeed. So the stall horn is going to be blaring over there. We're just going to be hanging on the feather edge of that propeller. Show me that you can control the airplane in that flight regime. And that really shows mastery of the aircraft more than almost any other maneuver. If you can do that successfully, you can really fly the airplane. And in the process of practicing this, you're going to get so comfortable doing slow flight, it's going to feel like a joke. And you're also going to be very comfortable in that stall regime and not afraid of the stall. And I think there's so many pilots that are afraid of stalls. And I don't really know why. I think it's because we've got multiple generations of kind of young, inexperienced CFIs, and that's nothing against them, but they just haven't done a lot of spins. They haven't done a lot of stalls. They're just scared of them. But that's a maneuver I'd love to see in the private pilot.
Yeah, I agree. Because I feel like a lot of people are practicing like I was taught during private, and other people are taught during private. I mean, I don't teach my students this, but like they're taught to do slow flight at a specific speed. So if it's like 60 knots, it's like the plane's barely even in a position where the horn's even going to start blaring. It's like sort of useless.
Yep.
It's I don't know. I don't agree with the whole like let's go pick a specific airspeed and hold
Right.
it there, and then like that's not
And
really realistic. That's
and
just
so my
stupid.
argument, I'm 100% agree with you. My argument is you go to the slow flight section of maneuvering during slow flight. So that's task A, area of operation 7, and you read down here in the skills. And it says skill 3 is establish and maintain an airspeed at which any further increase in angle of attack, increase in load factor, or reduction in power would result in a stall warning, a buffet or a stall horn. So my argument is during a check ride, I should hear the stall horn go off every time during this maneuver, because the info note in the appendix section says that during slow flight, so this is back on in the, what appendix is this? Yeah, appendix 3. During maneuvering during slow flight, it says if the applicant recognizes the stall indication and makes appropriate correction, a momentary activation does not constitute unsatisfactory performance on this task. So I think a lot of people think that if the stall horn goes off during slow flight, they fail the maneuver. That's not the case. In fact, I think the stall horn has to go off, because how do I know the speed you're flying at that any increase in AOA would result in a stall horn if I don't know where the stall horn's going to come on? Like you have to show me, hey, there's the stall horn. Now I'm going to reduce AOA and get right above it and hold this speed right there. So that's the proper way to do this maneuver, I think. But you're right. Most flight schools just slow to this arbitrary, we're going to fly 65 knots. And I'm like, well, that might be slow flight, but I don't really know. And sometimes to prove the point, I'll say, hey, can I have the controls for a second? I'll take the controls and I'll kind of load it up at about a 1.5 Gs or so, and the stall horn won't come on. And I'm like, see, we're not really at slow flight. We're just at slowish flight,
Yeah, have you had to disapprove anybody on the CFI check ride for lack of for that yet? Because I know that the CFI kind of has it written loud and clear that you have to do it that way.
You have either option.
Yes, you do. I haven't had any, and the way I run my CFI is I let you choose. So part of the CFI scenario for me is that you understand how to use the ACS. So I'm actually grading you on your ability to develop a plan of action to go out and give a mock check ride for a CFI, basically, which is your real check ride. And area of operation 10 says, hey, for single engine, the evaluator must select task A or B. So guess what everybody selects? They select task A, because task B is like the newest task, and it's 2 pages long, right? It takes a while. I haven't added them all up. There's probably at least 15 skills that you have to do on here. It is kind of longer. I have had a CFI get a disapproval on area of operation 10. I don't know what it was, forgot what the slow flight task. And if, as a CFI, this is important too, if you bust your CFI check ride for the slow flight stall spin section, then when you retest, we have to do spins. So on the retest, you have to bring an aircraft that is spinnable, and we have to do spins on your check ride. And that's actually in the FARs. That's a FAR requirement that if you bust your CFI test for a slow flight section, then you have to, on the re-examination, you must do spins, which is pretty interesting, So that should be some good motivation to not bust your check ride for slow flight stalls.
Do you put them in the spin, or do they put themselves in?
Both. Yeah.
Oh goodness. Yeah, I've heard. I saw something on Instagram the other day that said like, this guy was like, 3 of my students have already failed on the basic med update, and I just kind of feel like some examiners should give sort of leeway with newer tasks in the sense of like, if they get one of the numbers wrong, kind of just let them look it up or something.
Yeah, I can't say that I've ever busted anybody for getting that slightly wrong. And the FAA is pretty clear that like perfection isn't the standard. So if you say, yeah, you can only fly a plane that weighs 6,000 pounds, I'm like, are you sure about that? Where would I go to find that? Because that's obviously that's not something that you would need to know in the heat of the moment and have memorized. You're always going to have time to look something up like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Normally in that situation, though, they're not busting on that. I mean, there's something else that happened, and things are just building up, and eventually that was the thing that they just
Sure.
told them
And that's a good
that
point. You know, if I had somebody get that wrong, then that could be combined with other stuff. That could be indicative that, well, maybe they didn't get good training, right? Maybe there's some other gaps, and that's going to cause me to dig deeper. So yeah, you definitely
And then also, I've seen this a lot at the flight school. You know, you have a lot of students that if they come out of the ride and they get a disapproval, they're always coming out of the ride saying, "I failed because I was a foot high on my seat turn," or "The only reason I failed is because I just missed my point," or "I only failed because I missed this one item." And then you sit down with the examiner, and it was all these things that were just compounding over and over, and that might have been the breaking point, but it was never you failed for basic math or anything
sure.
like that.
And you know, if I was if I was king for a day again, another thing that I would add is in the Air Force we have something called a downgrade. And so when you take a check ride, you can pass the check ride, but get downgraded for certain maneuvers. And you still pass, you're still qualified, you don't need to go through any additional training. But as an evaluator, I can downgrade you for 2 or 3 different tasks. And we use that for a couple different things. One thing, we use it for your personal trend. So if last year you got downgraded for your assault landing, and this year I had to downgrade you for the assault landing, we've established a trend now. Maybe you need additional training in that event. The other thing we do is we use it for kind of fleet metrics. So we'll look at the whole group or wing or numbered Air Force, and we'll say, hey, we've over these 1,000 check rides we've given over the past year, we've issued 16 downgrades for areas related to stabilized approach. So that tells us as a community, hey, we might need to up our training in the stabilized approach. And then the last thing that'll happen is if I have to fail you on a check ride, you fail on 1 or 2 events similar to this, but I can downgrade you on multiple. So it gives you a more clear picture about what that failure, kind of all of the 1,000 cuts that death by 1,000 cuts, you can kind of see all of those different things that you were downgraded on. And I find myself, when I have to issue a disapproval in the civilian world, that I wish I could give all those downgrades, because there's usually, like you said, there's so many things that lead up to that. It's like, man, you've used all 9 lives that I've given you. And it's not that I'm giving you extra chances. It's just that the applicant that fails is usually consistently exceeding tolerances in other areas. And it's kind of death by 1,000 cuts, like I said.
So, Seth, I actually had a question that came up today at my school. How do you sort of bridge the gap between what the airplane flying handbook says that a maneuver should look like and what the ACS says the maneuver should look like? The specific example that came up today was a power on stall, which the ACS, I found it today, says 65% power or more. And then the airplane flying handbook says it should be takeoff power, unless obviously you're in a high performance aircraft, and that may be something else. But when we're flying a Warrior 160 horsepower, somebody suggesting that they do a power on stall at 65% power, it just seems ridiculous to me. But the ACS technically allows it, so I'm curious if DPEs are provided any specific guidance on
Are
that.
you able to stall a Warrior at 100% power? Because the Warriors 2 that we have down here, 100%. I mean, you can be in 25 plus degrees and it just won't break.
Oh yeah, you can break it. It's not easy, but I mean, it's a stable aircraft. But
Yeah, you got to pull pretty
it.
hard, honestly.
Yeah, like you slow it down to like 60 knots before you apply full power. You pull back about 20 degrees nose up. You'll break it.
Yeah, because what they're doing down here is they just have everyone down here do 75%.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do it 100% for sure.
I think you're right. You can do it at 100%. But let's look in the ACS here, because I think I've got an answer for you. So first of all, you're right. Skill 4 of the power on stall section, that's where it says set power as assigned by the evaluator to no less than 65% power. So it's no less than 65%. But then there's also an info note here that takes us back to Appendix 3 and the power on stall. In some high-performance airplanes, the power setting may have to be reduced below the ACS guidelines to prevent greater than 30 degrees nose-up pitch. So that answers that question. Is we can do 65 or less in a high-performance aircraft, right? But then if we look at the power on stall section of the airplane flying handbook, like you're saying here, it's with all it says to ensure practice with all possible takeoff and climb configurations with the power on stall. So takeoff or climb configuration. So set up the entry power on stall. The pilot establishes the airplane in a takeoff or climb configuration and slows the airplane to normal liftoff speed while canning or continuing to clear the area of other traffic. And then upon reaching the desired speed, pilot sets takeoff power or recommended climb power for the power on stall, often referred to as departure stall, while establishing the climb attitude. So I think, I mean, the way I read it, those line up pretty much right on with one another. Is there something in there I'm missing, you think?
Well, like for a Warrior at 160 horsepower, your takeoff power setting is 100%.
Yeah, and
like no exceptions.
I think
right? And then the ACS says at least 65%. So if you did 65%, can the examiner fail you if they didn't specify that they need to be 100%? Because the ACS allows it, but the airplane flying handbook says it's supposed to be done with full power.
Well, the airplane flying handbook doesn't say it has to be done at full power. The airplane flying handbook says to set takeoff power or recommended climb power.
Yeah. But if the aircraft's recommended climb power or takeoff power is 100%.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, the short answer is unless your examiner tells you to set a certain power, then set full power. You know, that the way I do this maneuver is I like in a high performance airplane, I do the 20-20-20 is what I call it. So we do 20 inches manifold pressure, 20 degrees nose high, and 20 degrees of bank. What I've found is that's about 65% power in a high performance airplane, maybe a little bit less than 65%. What we're doing, we don't slow down to configuration speed or to landing speed, or takeoff speed. Let me just go to the power on stall. What I'm getting at is it maintains, so skill 6 is maintain specified heading in straight flight or maintain specified angle of bank not to exceed 20 in turning flight. And it gives us the option here of doing the power on stall as a departure stall or as a cruise stall. And in a high performance aircraft, I like to simulate it as a cruise stall because I think that's maybe a little bit harder or more realistic, where you're up at 10,000 feet in ATC, or you get some sort of resolution advisory, and all of a sudden you're making a big maneuver at a really high density altitude, and you forget to move the power, and that's would kind of induce that power on stall. So kind of a more high altitude aerodynamic type of stall regime in a high performance aircraft. That's how I do it in like a twin. In a single engine aircraft, you could do it the same way, but you would be at full power or maybe slightly less than full power. But the ACS, whenever there's a discrepancy between the ACS and the airplane flying handbook, the ACS is the rule for the checkride. So anything above 65% is good. So even if the airplane flying handbook says, hey, do it at full power, the ACS says no less than 65. So that means we can use 65,
Yeah. ACS is regulatory, right? We got to remember that these airplane flying handbooks are not perfect. Right? There's a lot of problems in the airplane flying handbook. Just like Mike Schiffler kind of had a really, really good power hour this past week talking about the 1965 airplane flying handbook is significantly more accurate and much better than the 2018 or whatever it is now version.
Yeah, there's definitely some things in there that are different. One that comes up often that I run into is on the ground reference maneuvers, the 8s on pylons. The 8 skills and the 8s on pylons, none of them mention entering on the downwind or upwind. I forget whichever one the airplane flying handbook recommends. But if you look at the ATON pylons and the AFH, it makes it sound like, hey, it's regulatory that we're going to begin the maneuver on the downwind. And I think there's some compelling reasons to do it on the upwind, but regardless, I don't think we need to waste time figuring out where the wind's coming from. I think you need to have a general idea what your pivotal altitude is and be able to master the maneuver to the point where you can say, hey, there's my 2 pylons, do your clearing turns and roll into the maneuver immediately without worrying about where the wind's coming from, because the plane's going to find its pivotal altitude and you're going to make it work. Same thing around turns around a point. I don't care where the wind's coming from. I want you to do turns around a point, and while doing turns around a point, you're going to correct appropriately for wind. That's kind of the point of the maneuver. So that's another place where the AFH makes it sound like choosing where the wind's from is very important before you begin the maneuver, and the ACS just doesn't say anything about that. I think it's completely reasonable to have you do these maneuvers in any wind condition. Just have you go out and do them.
Back to the power on. Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Seth. That the power on stall. Imagine doing it at full power from cruise. That's not realistic. You're going to be going so fast. By the time you get, you're not going to be able to do a power on stall and keep it within pitch 30 degrees. No airplane.
I don't know if that's true, but the airplane flying handbook actually says to slow down to take off speed.
Well, yeah, exactly. You have to be slow enough. You got to be pretty slow, then go full power, then attempt the maneuver. Sometimes people just do it from a, too fast of a speed. That's a common issue with the power on stall, and then the airplane just zooms up. There's no bueno.
Yeah. Yeah, the skill 3, at least in the private, it gives us the option to do a takeoff, departure, or cruise configuration as specified by the evaluator. So those are the 3 conditions. You should be practicing this. And, again, I hate teaching the test here. What you should be concerned about as a CFI is giving power on stalls in all of the phases that your student could potentially encounter them. So a power on stall isn't just a takeoff phenomenon, right? It could happen in the cruise configuration as well. So you need to go practice those.
Yep, agreed. But, I think it, like you said, it depends. If you're in cruise, don't put 100%. But if you're at a slow speed, like a takeoff speed, yeah, go 100. If you want, go 100%. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, just like you said, it completely depends on where you are in the flight regime.
Right. But back to what John was saying, yeah, I think most of the training fleet you can do at full power. It is going to get pretty excessive on the nose. Well, it'll get more than 20 to slightly more than 20 degrees nose high. So it'll get higher than what you're used to. And that could set you up for a more severe break, which I think once your student has been gotten used to stalls more, that's a good thing, because it's going to break hard left or hard right in some cases, and they're really going to want to jump in with aileron to try to correct that, and that's a great time to show the pair, bring in the pair recovery, and say, okay, on this power on stall recovery, if that wing drops, we're going to go from doing a power or a stall recovery to doing a spin recovery, because that's an important thing that I think gets missed out. We don't train the spin recovery enough. We talk about it academic sense about the pair, but very few student pilots that go to their private have ever spun an airplane. So when I ask them about spins, that in theory they know about pair, but they've rarely practiced it. And doing a real power on stall with a big wing drop, that's a great opportunity to practice that spin recovery.
Yeah, I agree. About that, because it's like in the airplane, even some CFI applicants in the airplane flying handbook, it specifically explains the why behind everything in pair. Like, why are we actually pulling power idle? Why are we doing? And it also is interesting that pair is not the case for every aircraft. I got asked on my multi-check ride, is it pair or is it something else for the multi-engine? And it's actually PREA in some aircraft or some other, fluctuation of acronyms.
Yeah, it's all basically the same. It might be slightly out of order if it's written in there. specifically for the AFH.
In my experience, the spin usually significantly stops once you pull power idle. Regardless of the condition. Obviously, you want to go through with the whole 4 steps, but when I was doing my spin training, there was one time where I pulled power idle and we were out of the spin before I even could finish the whole,
If
the whole
a
spiel.
172 is very spin resistant, so it's gonna come out of the spin really quick if you don't let it develop. If you're in a spinnable 172 and you let it go past incipient and really get into that third turn where it starts to tighten, especially going to the left, it's going to tend to, it'll tighten up and stay in the spin a bit longer. But yeah, if you just let go of the controls, it's going to recover. Another interesting, you mentioned a multi in the spin. That's something that I bring up on the VMC recovery. Rather than look at the VMC demonstration as like this totally new thing that we only do in twins, if you really look at the VMC recovery process, it's really just a spin recovery. So the VMC demonstration is really just an approach to a spin and a spin recovery. That's all that it is. It's not really a new thing that's unique to a multi. It's just a spin recovery. And I think that's a good mindset to take into your multi-engine training, is that the VMC isn't anything new. You're just a twin-engine aircraft is a little bit more likely to spin in slow flight with asymmetric thrust, after an engine failure. Because of that asymmetry, you're more likely to get into a spin. So that VMC recovery is power to idle, rudder opposite direction, neutralize ailerons, pitch nose down. Whatever specific order you do that in, you're doing it all kind of at the same time, but it's basically spin recovery.
Yeah. One other odd thing that I found recently, totally unrelated to spins, but I had a student get asked about a timed approach, and the first thing he thought of was, when you look at an instrument chart, it says, time 60, 90, 120, regardless, the speed and then the time. So he was referring to that, but the examiner actually wanted him to answer about some, old method for shooting an approach called the timed approach, but it wasn't necessarily timing an approach.
Oh, I don't know. I might have done or known what a timed approach was, but the only timing that I've ever done on an approach is, back in the day when I was flying an airplane that just had an ADF and you're trying to do it with no DME. So you're, or a VOR, I forget what. Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah.
Do you want applicants to set a timer when they're doing an approach, or do you not care? I know some examiners are like really big on, if you're doing an ILS, you should set a timer kind of thing.
Not unless the approach we're doing requires timing. If none of the approaches that we're planning to do that day require timing, I'll generally ask it in the ground eval about when would it be appropriate to time. For the most part now, especially with the new ACS, I'm doing usually 3 RNAV approaches because they're just so easy to get everything done, and most of the planes that I'm giving Checkrides in are WAS capable, so we're pretty much doing 3 RNAV approaches now.
Hey Seth, I actually was going to ask about that. With the new instrument ACS coming in line with the CFI PTS, where the precision approach task, all it requires is an approach that goes to a DA. There's not even a requirement for 300 feet AGL
Correct.
anymore. Are you looking to fly like a whole instrument check ride where you just do like an LP or like an LNAV VNAV, LNAV plus V, and then like an LPV to round it out?
Yeah.
Or do you still like to see the ILS and everything?
No. I've done several check rides where we only touch RNAV approaches. Yeah, awesome. The typical, I'll typically do the LPV first, and then I'll turn SBAS off, and we'll do the next 2 approaches using, sometimes it'll still draw the advisory glide slope. That kind of gets into the weeds on what type of avionics are installed. But we'll do the first one precision, and then the next 2 will be non-precision. Of course, one of those will be the circle. But they're all RNAV, and it's made my life easier as an examiner because we don't have to go hunting. It wasn't the ILS that was hard to find. It was actually the the two different types of non-precision approaches. So I'd have to go find like an RNAV and then try to find a VOR, and that was the difficult part.
Yeah, fair enough. That makes sense. Cool. Yeah, I'm just excited to see more GPS-based check rides.
Yeah,
really.
it makes sense. It really does.
Can I go ahead and piggyback off what we were talking about earlier about when to feather an
Oh,
engine?
yeah, sure.
So this morning, actually, I was flying in Apache, and on departure, we're going. We get to the point, insufficient runway remains. Go to put our gear up, and as we're going to put our gear up, the entire aircraft just yaws to the right. And at first, I was thinking that the other pilot had actually kicked the rudder, because that's what it felt like, because it didn't sound like anything had changed in the airplane. And we looked over and we saw that the RPM had completely just started to drop on the right engine. So we're going to run through the drill as what we had planned to do. And the second that we go and apply some rudder there, immediately we got almost 100% thrust back on that right engine. So now it starts to yaw back in the other direction because we had rudder in. Well, that continued about 2 or 3 times, and we ended up bringing the power back, is what the instructor said. He's like, don't actually kill it, just bring it back. And we found out that when we were below about 2,000 RPM, it was just producing normal power. Originally, we were thinking maybe it was a propeller governor issue. Couldn't figure it out. And it ended up, I think it is still grounded, but it may not be. I'll have to check with them. But yeah, we were able to come back around, and we actually climbed up to pattern altitude and then came in and landed. But we decided not to shut it down because it was still producing power, just albeit a little uneven. But we'd rather have something than nothing, in that opinion.
Yeah, it sounds like y'all did a great job. That's actually interesting failure mode. I might steal that for a future check ride. But surging from idle to full power. But yeah.
Well, it wasn't to idle. That was what was weird. And the thing is, it would surge. And it got faster and faster each time that it had done it. And the first time that it happened, there was a solid 2 or 3 seconds in between that surge. So, we put in the rudder, and then pretty much, the second after we put the rudder in, then when it surged back to full power, we already had that left rudder put in, that it now was sending us back in that direction. So, looking back, maybe shutting it down could have just saved that, but also at the same time, we were able to keep it, bring it back around. No, it was interesting though. We came back and they rolled the trucks, and then we got a cool little tour of the trucks. That was
fun. No, it sounds like y'all did a great job. That's exactly what I would have done probably. I think, on deciding whether or not to run the drill and feather it at a low altitude, I think the fact that y'all discovered that it wasn't actually failed means that y'all were taking your time, and that's a good thing, because I tell everybody, the worst thing you can do in a multi-engine aircraft is the wrong thing too fast, or really any aircraft, but especially the twin, because if you panic and you try to feather something quickly and you feather the wrong engine, that's a lot more catastrophic than just continuing to fly the airplane with an engine that's, out of sorts until you've got a good handle on the control of the airplane. You've taken your time to really verify it, maybe do some troubleshooting. If you're below 3,000, go ahead and, get everything full forward, identify, verify, feather, get it taken out. But I think what you guys did was good. Y'all were able to analyze that, hey, a little bit of partial power removes the problem. Y'all could have, I think it would have been perfectly fine for y'all to get up to pattern altitude and go ahead and feather it, and that way it's just done. That would have been fine too, but the way y'all handled it sounded like it turned out well. And once you're on final, you're at a low power setting, so it almost doesn't matter if it's surging a little bit of power. That's not a big deal.
And what we were thinking for the main part there was, we'd rather even have it surging and get us up to pattern altitude than be at 300 feet and unable to climb because we decided to completely shut it down. So
yeah. No, that's cool. I'm glad it turned out well.
Was this just a training flight, Charles, or for like multi or MEI, or was this like what kind of?
It was supposed to be a time building flight, so we were going on a 10-hour flight, and then got a total of 0.4 for our 10 hours.
A 10-hour flight. Where were you going? Like South America?
No, we were just going down to the south of Florida and then up to South Carolina and then back.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, that's fun.
Hey, Elias, I noticed you jumped in over from your CFI study group page. How's it going?
Can you hear me now?
I'd buy five.
Yeah, sorry about that. No, it's great. We have a few CFI initial folks that have been studying a lot recently, and then we have we have 3 double I students studying. We've been kind of helping them out their check rides in the next week or two. So yeah, going pretty good. Pretty busy. Every night we're studying something.
Yeah, that's great. Well, this is the first time I'm doing a live podcast. So I just did the podcast, and then kind of the end of the show, we're just having this discussion. But I thought I would call you out because I'm fixing to wrap up here. But anybody listening to the podcast that's looking for a place to study, if you want me to share Discord channel on the podcast notes, I'd be happy to do that if you want. I think it's a good thing you got going on there.
Yeah, I'll pass that over to you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You bet. But yeah, anybody that's studying for their CFI, that's a great little group that you have going over there. It seems like every time I log into this Discord, I see the one of the study rooms has people in it, and y'all are going at it.
Yes, sir. Grinding every day.
That's great. Well, any other hanging around? I'll take one more question if you have it, or we can just wrap it up.
Any plans for the holidays?
I was able to swing Christmas off, so I've got a good 5 days, I think, off that fit over Christmas, so I'm not having to be on the road for that. So that's nice, and just spending time with family.
That's fun. I actually wonder if there's ever been a check ride on Christmas Day. That'd be funny.
Oh yeah, that's a committed examiner. I don't know.
Yeah.
People complain about CFI or DPE fees enough. I don't know that they want to see a DPE fee for Christmas Day. So.
Exactly.
Hey, I've seen rates here $2,000 plus now, so I can't imagine what it's like on Christmas.
Yeah, the fees are, man. I've tried to do some informational posts on Reddit, even though that Reddit is a little bit of a toxic place.
I saw your post on there. It makes sense. If you do the math, I mean, you're not, by the time you drive there and all that, as you said in that post, and do the whole thing and then debrief and prove, it's like you're getting paid, like, what do you say, half of what an airline pilot would get paid.
But, the main thing that's driving up is this huge increase in demand, and that is going to fall off over the next couple of years. It just has to, because we're kind of at an unsustainable rate. But something I would like to see is if the FAA started tracking prices, and then we could maybe set up like a cap of a percentage of the national average, or do some sort of something like that. Main thing is to have transparency on, hey, what's the nationwide average? So you as a consumer kind of know, all right, is this DPE charging me more than the national average or less? Where's that at? And I think a little bit more transparency would go a long ways to making the fees more reasonable.
What are you charging right now?
So I charge
very cheap.
I charge $700 and $800 for single and multi at my home airport, and sometimes when I travel. But most of the time when I'm traveling, I'm having to cover hotels and travel fees and just being gone. So I charge $1,000 flat rate when I'm traveling, and then I stopped charging for retests and discontinuances. I think more than a year ago. I don't charge any additional fees for that.
You are below the national average for sure. I can promise you that. I hear all the CFIs in my group are telling me crazy stories all around the country. The worst one I've ever heard was $3,000 out in California for initial CFI check ride.
Yeah, I do think honestly, there are probably some DPEs out there that are more, they're beyond that reasonable fee range. But the reasonable fee is a subjective term. So what's reasonable for me might not be reasonable for someone else. And I can kind of understand both sides of it, where if a DPE is a Delta captain and he can pick up a premium trip that's going to pay, $10,000 or whatever crazy number, or he can stay at home and give check rides. He's going to charge more than I do, maybe. Now, whether or not that is ethical is probably a different question. I think a code of ethics. If today I could sign a code of ethics as a DPE and that also came with a bill of rights as a DPE, I would 100% do that. And that code of ethics could say, unless in extenuating circumstances, I'm not going to charge. I'm going to be within 20% of the national average. Whatever, we could wordsmith it and get together. But I don't think it should just be, hey, we get to charge whatever we get to charge, because there will be those people that take advantage of that.
They need to hire more DPEs. That's like in my opinion, the best solution. And if that means give DPEs either make the requirements slightly less or give them a little bit more incentive in another way, to encourage people to apply to be a DPE and make it also less political, as we all know that there is a little bit of politics that play into all that. They need to make it a little bit easier to, have more DPEs in the pool. That'll solve that problem of people charging $3,000 or $4,000.
Yeah, then that's another. It's again a complicated issue, because to hire more DPEs, we have to have more ASIs to manage those DPEs, and hiring an ASI is a multi-year process. And you've worked with government close enough to know that, okay, if let's say a new civilian billet opens up to hire a GS-11 or GS-12, government regulation dictates that that's going to take several months just to source the job, and then I've got to interview applicants, and then they come on board. I got to send them through training. Then once they're trained, now I can designate more DPEs. Now I have to send the DPEs through training. So it's a really long process, and we've already started that process of hiring more. Like, that started last year, but just nothing in this process happens fast, and just demand has increased so much faster than the system was ever designed to handle. And yeah, the FAA was a little late to the game. They probably should have anticipated this big surge, and they've been working underneath CRs just like everybody else in the government. So we finally got a reauthorization bill passed, and the money will start to flow in. But I think it'll be a day late and a dollar short. I think we're going to have we're going to have a bunch more new DPEs at the same time. Flight training decreases a lot because of just the inevitable market, saturated with pilots, and less people are going to enter the training environment.
Seth, I have a very simple question for you. I'm starting I'm starting my instrument. Would it make sense in my paper logbook to start that on a whole nother page, or just continue the next ride right after where I got signed off for my PPL?
No, just continue the next line. I wouldn't close out a page unless, I wouldn't do that. I would just continue.
All right.
If you don't have a digital logbook, though, I'd start doing that now. I know a lot of the airlines are requiring that you have to submit a digital one. If you also have
that's really good advice. While you're young and have less hours, it's much easier to transition to a digital. And if you want to keep a paper for posterity, that's fine. A lot of people like that. But definitely, if you're going to do this as a profession, an electronic logbook doesn't have to be ForeFlight, although ForeFlight has a good one. And they also ForeFlight has a new feature where it will automatically email you a copy of your logbook every month in Excel format. And it just does that automatically. So I signed up for that, and I've been getting my monthly ForeFlight email logbook. So it's backed up like 3 different ways.
That's great advice on the digital logbook. I appreciate it.
I just really wish that ForeFlight had better endorsements and remarks for instructors to log, like what we did in the flight.
What do you mean by that? I mean, there's a comment section, or are you talking something different?
I mean, there is the comments, but like it's difficult. Like for one, like I can't look at things that I have endorsed. Like I have to make my own copy of it, and it's not the same thing. You can keep track of your endorsements, but not like the remarks that you've left in somebody's logbook. I can't go in and edit it later. The student can't put in the remarks themselves and then have me go in and sign it. Like what I like to do is have my students know how to do it themselves. So like write in what we did and that kind of thing, and I just check it over and then sign it, and they can't do that in ForeFlight.
So you're
really
actually coming. Your student can put in their comments, and then you can sign it if they send it to you. So they can like send it on ForeFlight, and they can put in their own comments. You can see it. They can have their whole entry. And additionally, if you have them do it that way, you can also add instructor comments, and then on top of that, you can save it as a draft to your own logbook. So to make sure that you guys have the identical information. Same with the endorsements. If you send an endorsement from your ForeFlight account, if you're using the ForeFlight, obviously, then the endorsement will show up on their end, and it will show up as a copy on your ForeFlight account.
I'm aware the endorsements copy over. The other things don't do what I want them to do, so I'm not happy about it. But you're right, I can do it. It's kind of a hacky workaround, and I'd like a box just for remarks, not comments. Because what if I want to leave comments about how the flight went or improvement things that I don't necessarily want to be attached to what we did in the flight and like the actual regulatory remarks for what training is for. Like I want a separate spot for that.
Gotcha.
Fair enough. Seth, for Christmas, everybody needs to get you a ForeFlight something, because I know you love ForeFlight. I just saw they released new merchandise.
Yeah, that's I need to get some ForeFlight swag. I've got like a ForeFlight key ring. I think that's the only ForeFlight thing that I have. But if I do much more ForeFlight content, I'm gonna have to get like a ForeFlight tattoo or something.
They haven't sponsored you yet? Come on.
Heck no. Yeah, they don't even know who I am. But I enjoy using their product. I appreciate everybody joining me. We went a lot longer than I was expecting, but that's a good thing. A lot of my podcasts are longer, so if you're listening in still on the podcast or the YouTube channel, appreciate you hanging in there. And if you want to join us next week, check out the Discord channel at vsl.aero. There's a way for you to subscribe there to the channel, and I'll make the announcements of when I'm recording the live podcast there. And you can hop on and join us for next week's conversation. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.